Arthur, what about the experience of depth as profundity? I mean, that people have. I mean, depth, to see things deeply or to experience things deeply also means to experience them more fully in a way.
Yes, but that's a higher degree of what I'm talking about. In fact, that we use experience in depth as an amplification of what I'm saying. To the surface view you have is superficial. I see you doing it.
Okay.
I'm trying to do my thing. The superficial dimension is surface, that display thing.
Right.
And that's not to put it down. It has value for certain things, like analysis.
That's what superficial means, is
Yes.
surfacial, on the surface.
Right. But I'm not discrediting
Right.
it. I'm saying that the dimension of depth complements it and gives it a different kind of value, or a different contribution of value, which is not, you can't get value from two dimensions. You would think you could get more from two dimensions than you could from one, but in some respects you get less. For instance, you go to the broker and say, what's the best stock? And he may pull out a lot of tables and say, General Motors is going to have a stock split. On the other hand, they're beginning to lose markets in foreign countries, so maybe Chrysler is low now and it may go up. On the other hand, better stay out of the automobile market and buy electronics, which is a really up-and-coming industry. So he gives you a lot of alternatives, and you could spot these around on a relationship, but it does not tell you which is the best stock. That was the simple question you asked him. And of course, he can't say. He fills you out with a lot of information. And this is much what we get.
The answer is time will tell, and time is depth.
Well, of course, by that time, it's too late.
Right.
At any rate, that's a good occasion to amplify this difference between value knowledge and relationship knowledge, which is surface knowledge. Mm-hmm. I'd rather not call it superficial knowledge, because that's a downer. That's
you mean it's planar, two-dimensional?
Planar, yes. Surface in one dimension is what you could see in a picture. Mm-hmm. But a picture is different from the reality. There's something else I'd like to say about time, which it's timely now because of Bergson, the revival of Bergson. Mm-hmm. They've pulled him out of the grave, and I'm afraid they'll just bury him again, and maybe more permanently even. But they've at least realized, the process philosophers, that Bergson was an important philosopher. And they've had this conference on Bergson in Galveston, to which many physicists were asked. And they were saying that Bergson had anticipated quantum physics, and he's turning out, he argued with Einstein way back, and they're now saying Bergson was correct.
What was the issue?
The issue was the symmetry of time, or asymmetry. Bergson insisted that time was becoming. It was not symmetrical. It was different in the past and the future, whereas science is forced to say it's symmetrical because the formulas don't make a distinction between the direction of time.
Yeah, this is pretty much the same distinction you're talking about as
right.
Between time and the spatial dimensions.
That's exactly the thing, and I just didn't realize, and it wasn't so much longer, I think it was 1919 that Bergson said this, and I was thinking it in 1926 when I was doing relativity. That this was the reason for my theory of process, because I wanted to say that you could not account for the universe as a structure in time and space. It was a structure in space which changed through time, and you couldn't anticipate it. And of course I've emphasized novelty, but Bergson included the novelty in the becoming. He said there's a perpetual novelty occurring. And one of the writers, Capek I think it was, describing Bergson, described it as droplets of novelty on the line of time.
Yeah, we're on now. What's on? Yeah, okay. Good. Now just lean forward and change your glasses. So you want to continue about Bergson?
Yes, it's he has this feeling of the difference between the time dimension and the space dimension, which I think is so important. But there's a point more that I was coming to with the drops of novelty. If I were more careful, I would have said Bergson talks about duration as distinct from time. I frankly admit that I didn't get this on my reading of Bergson in ancient times.
You mean ancient times, meaning several years ago?
Oh, reading in the 30s, 40s, whenever. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't get it from Henry Stapp, who was trying to explain it to me. It wasn't until I read through several of these papers on the conference that I got the idea, which were including quotes from Bergson. Duration meant that time couldn't be reduced to a point, as is done in science. Mm-hmm. Well, he didn't know about the quantum of action. I would equate those very short times, short durations, to quanta of action.
But even quanta of action have frequencies. They have...
Well, frequencies or periods, it doesn't matter what you say. I mean, they're a very short period that can't be, when you reduce it, then you're in a quarter of a phase or a half a phase. You're not all the way round. You remember the big point in that essay, Are the Foundations of Science Adequate, that you helped me with?
Yes.
The big point was when I had this cycle of action or learning cycle going on outside of time. How could you have a circulation without space or a duration without time?
Right.
And then I had to say, well, this is creating time. It's in meaning space. It's not in real time.
Can you be a little bit more clear? What is creating time?
The cycle of action or the learning cycle.
Which is
this buzzing aroundness
that the photon does.
That the photon is doing. It's a learning cycle in the sense that it has phases. In other words, it starts with a blind action and then goes through a reaction and then has a conscious reaction and then a conscious action. Those 4 phases are the learning cycle. But it means that anything from the photon on can be learning in its own terms, at its own much more rapid rate.
How can you say that the photon is learning? I mean, what license have you?
See, I invert the whole problem. How do you know what learning is? See, how do you define learning? I think the most satisfactory definition is to say it's a phase in a cycle. It's that point in a cycle when you realize what you've done. And then you act accordingly. Now, if you use that to define time, instead of trying to define, try to define learning, so you can't define learning except in terms of itself. Mm-hmm. So you make that basic and define times in terms of it. Then you say, time is that which is required to learn, not clocks.
So you're making learning a fundamental universal process.
Right, learning the most fundamental thing. And I think that's perfectly legitimate, and it's actually better science than taking time as the undefined term. Because you can't get from time to learning, but you can get from learning to time.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, learning is the whole, of which time is one of the phases, or one of the aspects, space being another. The time gives the experience part of learning, and the space gives the intellectual or rational part of learning,
comparison,
where you compare one thing to another.
Mm-hmm.
And this also gives you gratis the possibility of acting intelligently, because you're acting on the basis of knowing. Because those then become the three phases. The first phase, being the most neglected of all, the blind urge that has no explanation. See, that was what both St. Georgi and Shapley said what was needed in science, something to account for the ongoing urge of life.
Mm-hmm.
So you get the whole package from this learning cycle, which has all these aliases: alias quantum of action, alias photon, alias quantum of uncertainty. It's beautiful.
Are you talking about the spin of the photon itself?
Yes.
And any spin must needs go through phases.
Mm-hmm. I'm talking about the 2 pi that's always there in Planck's constant. Planck's constant is generally called h. And then if you take the 2 pi out, it's called h bar. And you couldn't take the 2 pi out if it wasn't there. The other way to see it is that it's angular momentum. Oh, that's another alias, I forgot that. But angular momentum is something going around like a skater buzzing around this way, and when they pull the weights in and they speed up and so forth. That's angular momentum.
What's 2 pi for the folks?
Oh, 2 pi is the universal circle, the symbol of the circle. The wholeness. You see, remember the ancients were always talking about the planets had to go in perfect circles. Mm-hmm. This was an insight into the wholeness of the circle as unity. Kepler discovered, oh no, it wasn't a circle, it was an ellipse. But the fundamental insight of circularity was basic to meaning, even if it was not sufficient or adequate for astronomy.